Now, Descartes is trying to solve the same sort of problem that Plato and Socrates are trying to solve. It's this question, well, how is it possible to get any knowledge at all in the first place? In particular, how can I make sure that any of my beliefs are actually true, that I'm not being deceived? And now, Descartes is starting from this place where he grew up being taught certain things by reading, say, Aristotle, Plato's student who came after him, all around 300 BC, and now here's Descartes some 2,000 years later, wondering, well, gosh, I learned all this stuff about the way the world works from Aristotle and my teachers, and then it turned out that a lot of it wasn't true. So, for example, for the longest time, most people assumed that the Earth was in the center of the universe, and if you look up at the sky, you see the stars going around the Earth and the sun going around the Earth. You assume, yeah, the Earth's at the center. Everything else is going around it. Now, that's not the only reason folks had to think that. It wasn't just this naive, like, sure, it looks like everything's going around us. I guess we must be in the center. There was a really well worked out theory that all made a whole lot of sense. So, for example, if you go back to the time of Aristotle, Plato's student, Aristotle thought, well, gosh, we need an explanation of why things move the way that they move. And you start noticing things like, well, gosh, if you've got like a cup of water like this, and you put a rock in it, it moves to the bottom of the water. But then if you take something like this and you try and take some of this air that's around us and put that into the water, well, this is fun. The air does not sink to the bottom of the water, it rises up above the level of the water. And then you've got stuff like, I'm not even going to touch that because it's really going all bonkers. This is like my greatest pleasure right now because I never get to do this when I'm actually in class because of, like fire codes and stuff, but I get to have like real fire for our lesson today. But look at that fire, that seems to be going up above even the air itself. And so there seems to be this idea that somehow, well, things that are made out of earth, like this rock and metals and wood, those things all seem to go down towards the lower level of things. And then this stuff, this water, that seems to rise above the level of the earth stuff. But then there's this air that rises above the water, and then there's this fire that rises above the air. And you can start to see how that all makes sense if you assume, well, look, there's a general principle that governs how things move in the universe. It's that the kind of thing that something's made out of determines where it's going to try and get to. So if you have this picture of the universe in which you've got the Earth at the center, and then around that Earth you've got a sphere of water, and then around that sphere of water you've got a sphere of air, and then around that sphere of air you've got a sphere of fire, and you might even suspect that above that sphere of fire you've got the sphere of this fifth element that we could call the quintessence. That's what like stars and suns are made out of. Well, if you've got the universe being made of these nested spheres, then you can explain all of these different movements that we just explained. If you just say, look, what something is made out of is always going to try and find the sphere where the rest of it is. So Earth, if I lift it up above the level of the Earth and above where there's some water, I'm keeping it away from where it naturally wants to be, which is as close to the center of the universe as possible, which explains when I drop it down, it tries to get as close to the center of the Earth as is possible. And the water, it doesn't want to be below the Earth, it wants to be in the sphere that's right above the Earth, so it rises above the water, but below the air, because that's the proper place for water. And so on with the air, when you blow bubbles in there, it rises up so that it's covering the level above the water, and then you've got the fire that's rising up here. So it's not just that it sure looks like the sun and the stars are going around the Earth. There's this whole theory that all makes sense, but only if you assume that the Earth itself is the center of the universe. But of course, turns out that was all wrong. That as much sense as this theory made, and as much as it was actually able to explain a lot of like really interesting phenomena, like why bubbles rise and why rocks fall to the bottom of water and why flames point upwards, it was just wrong. And yet that's what people believe. That's what the greatest minds believed for thousands of years. They had really good reasons to think it was true, and yet turned out not to be true. So Descartes starts off in this place at the start of his first meditation saying, look, I've read all this stuff that seemed really plausible. I learned it in school, but then I grew up. I started doing my own experiments. I started dissecting animals and people in my house in France. I started doing some mathematics, and I figured out, oh gosh, actually all that stuff I learned in school was wrong. But what if I'm just in the same position now that Aristotle was? What if I came up with some beliefs that make a lot of sense to me and have a nice theory behind them, but it could turn out that I'm just all wrong about that as well? How can I possibly be certain whether my beliefs are true? That's the challenge that Descartes has set himself. That's the challenge that I want all of us to pick up. And in my next video, I'll come back and give you a sketch of the kind of solution he's going to try and get in his second meditation.